Imagine yourself walking through a narrow medieval street long after sunset. The stones beneath your feet slick from an afternoon drizzle, and the distant toll of a church bell echoing between timbered walls. The air is heavy with smoke from hearth fires, and the faint sweetness of crushed herbs hung above doorways to ward off misfortune. As you move deeper into the town, you begin to sense something else in the atmosphere. Not a smell or a sound, but a pressure. A quiet, ever-watchful authority that weighs on every woman who passes by. In this world, purity isn't simply a private virtue. It's a measurement, a currency, a boundary line that can elevate a family or doom it to disgrace. And whether anyone admits it aloud or not, a woman's reputation often means more to her community than her talents, her thoughts, or her character. Tonight, we're stepping into a society where a single assumption could define a lifetime, where whispers carried further than facts, and where proving innocence mattered more than truth itself. Before we begin unraveling the rituals that grew around this obsession, take a moment to steady yourself. We're entering a world built on stories people desperately wanted to believe. As you approach the outskirts of a manor estate, torchlight flickers across high stone walls, and you can hear murmurs from servants preparing the hall for an upcoming marriage. What should be a moment of celebration feels strangely tense, as if the entire household is balancing on an invisible ledge. This is because, in medieval Europe, a woman's perceived purity wasn't just a moral matter. It was the foundation of alliances, inheritance, and family honor. A father's reputation, a mother's pride, a dowry agreement, even the legitimacy of future heirs all rested upon a single expectation. And from that expectation grew a network of rituals, examinations, and so-called tests that promised certainty in a world that understood almost nothing about the body. Step closer and you'll notice it in every detail. The anxious glances, the hurried preparations, the way conversations hush as someone passes. This society is obsessed with the idea of proving virtue, even though its methods are built on superstition rather than knowledge. And in the center of this pressure stands a young woman who has no control over the judgments that await her. Tonight, we begin to peel back the layers of the myth that shaped her fate. Walk a little farther, and you'll reach a small courtyard where two elderly women sit sorting linen by lantern light. Their hands move with practiced efficiency, but their eyes keep drifting toward the manor door, waiting for someone to summon them. In this world, these women, midwives, healers, neighbors, often carry the impossible responsibility of declaring a girl pure or impure, despite having no real tools, no scientific framework, and no authority beyond the trust of the community. Their knowledge is a mixture of folk wisdom, superstition, and whatever scraps of anatomy have been passed down through stories rather than study. Yet people cling to their words because the alternative is uncertainty, and uncertainty can destabilize families, marriages, even entire social networks. As you watch them whisper to each other in the dim light, you begin to understand how fragile the system truly is. A single rumor, a single misinterpretation, a single poorly timed observation could send shockwaves through a household. In a society terrified of shame, these women are expected to deliver clarity, even when the truth is that clarity doesn't exist. And hovering behind their quiet work is the awareness that a young woman's future may hinge on their next decision. Beyond the courtyard, a narrow path leads to the local chapel where a priest arranges candles along the altar. His movements are slow, deliberate, and heavy with symbolism. For many families, religious authority gives weight to the obsession with purity. Sermons warn of moral decay, cautioning that a community's fortune is tied to its women's virtue. Confessions become investigations, and spiritual guidance blends uncomfortably with social policing. You stand in the doorway, listening as the priest mutters prayers meant to protect the upcoming union. But beneath those words lies something far more controlling. The belief that purity is evidence of obedience, loyalty, and worthiness. This belief doesn't simply influence marriages. It shapes how women speak, how they walk, how they exist in their own skin. Every glance is evaluated, every friendship interpreted, every absence questioned. Even silence can be suspicious. In this environment, faith becomes intertwined with fear, and communities start to treat personal reputation as a form of divine ledger-keeping. The ritualistic weight of purity transforms ordinary moments into moral tests. And as you step back into the cool night air, you sense how deeply religion reinforces the expectations pressing down on the young woman at the center of our story. Now, as the night deepens, move toward the far end of the estate where the servants' quarters buzz with hushed conversation. They exchange theories, predictions, and anxieties about what will happen in the coming days, each convinced they know how these rituals will unfold. Their voices blend into a soft, uneasy chorus, revealing something essential. Purity isn't just a private matter. It's a spectacle, a communal project, a shared obsession that draws in people from every rank. The baker's wife speculates about past scandals. The stable boy swears he overheard a secret, and the housekeeper insists she can always tell when a bride is innocent. None of them have real evidence, but that doesn't matter. In a world without science, rumor becomes fact, and social narratives harden into truth. You stand quietly among them, realizing that the upcoming examination isn't about the bride at all. It's about maintaining the community's sense of order. These people aren't seeking accuracy, they're seeking reassurance. They want the world to make sense in the simplest way possible, even if that simplicity comes at the cost of someone else's life. And with that realization, the true weight of medieval virginity culture becomes unmistakably clear. Step inside the manor and the shift in atmosphere is immediate. The air is warmer here, thick with the scent of burning tallow candles and freshly cut herbs scattered across the floor to mask the smell of too many people working in too small a space. You move down a narrow hallway lined with carved wooden panels and tapestries faded from years of smoke. Servants hurry past you carrying bundles of cloth, pitchers of water, and trays of food meant for the guests who will soon arrive. But beneath all this preparation lies an unmistakable tension, the kind that settles into the corners of a household when something more is at stake than simple celebration. A noble family prepares for a purity inspection, though no one dares say the words aloud. Instead, they refer to it only as the assurance, a vague label meant to soften the truth. You feel eyes following you as you walk, not out of suspicion, but out of habit. In a world where a girl's virtue can determine alliances, wealth, and status, every step, every glance, every gesture becomes a potential clue. And nowhere is this scrutiny more intense than inside the homes of those with the most to lose. Move farther into the Great Hall, and you'll find a small group gathered near the hearth. A priest, a steward, and two older women whose roles are never openly acknowledged but always understood. Their conversation is low and deliberate, the kind that blends religious obligation with social expectation until the lines between them disappear entirely. In medieval Europe, purity was framed as more than a moral requirement. It was a spiritual safeguard, a sign that a household followed the proper order set by God and reaffirmed by the Church. The priest reminds the steward that the union must be blessed with clarity, a phrase that sounds gentle but carries enormous weight. The women nod, their expressions tight, aware that they will soon be called upon to provide an opinion no one should ever be expected to give. You stand nearby, watching the firelight flicker across their faces, and it becomes clear that this household is not preparing for a joyful union, but for an inspection justified through faith. Sermons, confessions, and rituals all blend together here, creating a world where purity is less about truth and more about maintaining the hierarchy that keeps families in their place. Step through a side passage and you'll enter a smaller chamber where the young woman at the center of all this pressure sits quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She wears a simple wool gown, dyed a modest shade that reflects her family's status without drawing attention. Her hair is neatly braided, her posture straight, her gaze fixed on the floor as if she's afraid her eyes might reveal too much. In this society, even innocence can look suspicious if someone decides it should. Around her stand two attendants, girls only a few years older, trying to reassure her with forced smiles. But they too understand the reality. The rules aren't the same for everyone. A man's past can be excused, forgotten, or ignored, but a woman's virtue is treated as permanent record, judged not by truth but by expectation. Every whisper, every sideways glance, every half-remembered rumor can weigh more heavily than facts. You watch her take a slow breath as another servant adjusts the fabric over her shoulders, and it becomes painfully clear that she is not preparing for a celebration. She is preparing for an examination that society insists is necessary, even though no one truly understands what it claims to measure. Leave the chamber and walk toward the inner courtyard, where a cluster of household workers huddle under a covered walkway to escape the evening chill. Their voices rise and fall in nervous conversation, each person convinced they know what a sign of purity looks like, even though their beliefs come from nothing more than hearsay and habit. They trade old stories about past marriages, tales of families ruined by accusations, and warnings about what can happen if the test doesn't go as expected. Some insist that a pure bride always walks with a certain grace. Others claim they can tell by the sound of her voice, while a few rely on descriptions passed down from their grandmothers. None of it makes sense, yet all of it is repeated as if it were proven fact. As you listen, you realize how these ideas spread, not through knowledge, but through fear. People cling to simple explanations because the alternative, uncertainty, frightens them. And so superstition becomes community law, shaping lives far more powerfully than any written rule. Here in the courtyard, the weight of expectation feels as real as the cold stone beneath your feet. Now return to the manor's great hall, where preparations continue with an urgency that borders on frantic. The long wooden table is being set with pewter plates and loaves of coarse bread, while tapestries are adjusted to hide cracks in the plaster walls. Yet despite the busyness, no one seems able to shake the anxiety hanging in the air. A test that should never exist has become the centerpiece of an entire evening, shaping conversations, guiding decisions, and influencing how every person moves through the space. You notice the steward pacing along the edge of the hall, counting guests under his breath as if order alone could keep chaos away. Nearby, the priest closes his book with a heavy thud, preparing himself for the role he believes God expects of him. And in a quieter corner, the two older women whisper to each other, reviewing the expectations placed upon them. This moment reveals the truth. Purity tests are not merely about the bride. They are about control, maintaining structure, reinforcing hierarchy, and keeping fear alive enough to prevent anyone from challenging the system. As you watch the hall fill with light and movement, you understand that this ritual thrives not because it is real, but because everyone believes they must participate to keep their world intact. Follow a dimly lit hallway to the far side of the manor, and you'll find a modest room where two women sit beside a low wooden table covered in bundles of herbs, folded cloth, and simple tools worn smooth by decades of use. These are the midwives, the closest thing this world has to experts, not because of training or textbooks, but because they have spent their lives observing births, tending wounds, and navigating the fragile boundaries of community expectations. Their wool gowns are patched at the elbows, their linen veils slightly yellowed from years of smoke and labor. Yet their presence carries authority. Families trust them to know what others cannot see, even though the truth is far more complicated. They work with knowledge passed through generations, built from superstition, fragments of experience, and whispered advice from elders long gone. As you sit quietly near the doorway, listening to them sort their tools, you begin to understand the weight they carry. Their words can soothe fears or ignite scandal, and they know that their judgment, fair or not, will shape the fate of the young woman waiting in the next room. In a society built on uncertainty, people cling to their guidance as if it were absolute. Move a step closer and watch as one of the midwives unwraps a small linen bundle, revealing the few items she relies on during examinations. A dull iron needle, a length of thread, a tiny clay pot of oil, and nothing else that resembles medical equipment. There are no charts, no diagrams, no written rules. Everything she knows has been taught through repetition, folklore, and community expectation. The women around her nod with practiced confidence, but their glances betray something deeper. The fear of misjudging a situation where mistakes carry consequences far beyond their control. These midwives are expected to interpret signs that don't exist, to validate beliefs built on rumor, and to provide certainty in a world that cannot define what it's trying to measure. Yet they rarely question the task placed before them. Survival depends on fulfilling the roles society demands. Their authority is both fragile and powerful, trusted and doubted in the same breath. As you observe their careful preparations, illuminated by the soft glow of an oil lamp, you realize that these women are navigating the same impossible system as everyone else. They are not arbiters of truth, only participants in a ritual the entire community insists on maintaining. Step into the adjoining space where a younger assistant kneels beside a wooden chest, sorting through bundles of dried plants tied with coarse twine. These herbs, mint, yarrow, calendula, and others she barely knows by name, are believed to reveal truths about the body, though none of them have any real connection to the task at hand. Still, the community clings to these plants as if they hold answers, trusting the midwives' rituals because they offer the comfort of structure. The assistant works with quiet focus, her fingers moving quickly, her linen sleeves rolled up to avoid snagging on splintered wood. She glances toward the doorway every few moments, aware that her role today holds unusual importance. For her, this is not just about helping the midwives. It is about proving herself capable in a profession where reputation is everything. A single mistake could stain her future, yet she carries on because she knows the stakes for the young woman waiting nearby are far greater. As you watch her place each herb into a neat row, you see how ordinary tools are transformed into instruments of judgment simply because the community believes they must be. Beyond the table, shelves carved from rough timber line the walls, filled not with medical references, but with clay jars labeled in fading ink, each containing powders, grounds, or crushed leaves collected from nearby fields. The midwives rely on these materials to perform small rituals meant to demonstrate diligence, even though none of them provide clarity about purity. They measure, mix, and assess not to find truth, but to satisfy the expectations of families who demand certainty. In the eyes of the community, these routines give weight to the final verdict. As you watch, one of the older women lifts a jar to her nose, inhales the sharp scent, and nods as if confirming something important. You know it's just a habit, a gesture passed through generations. Yet the others treat it as essential. This room, with its crude tools and worn jars, reveals how deeply superstition shapes their work. Their methods persist not because they are effective, but because they have always been used. And in a society built on tradition rather than knowledge, longevity is often mistaken for legitimacy. Now listen as the midwives begin discussing the upcoming inspection in cautious, measured tones. They speak about the young woman with a mixture of sympathy and detachment, aware that their words hold the power to alter her future, but equally aware that their own safety depends on aligning with the expectations of the household. A wrong conclusion could lead to accusations of incompetence or dishonesty, charges that can ruin a reputation, especially for women whose authority exists only through community trust. Their conversation circles around the same uncertainties: what the family expects, what past tests have required, and what the priest may want them to confirm. You can hear the hesitation in their voices each time they mention the bride's name. They know the system is flawed. They know the test proves nothing. Yet they also understand that refusing to participate is not an option. Their survival depends on compliance, and compliance requires playing a role they did not choose. As the room quiets and they begin packing their tools, you realize that the midwives are not enforcers of the system. They are prisoners of it, caught in the same web of fear, tradition, and expectation as everyone else. Walk into the manor's study, a narrow room lined with wooden shelves holding cracked manuscripts and hand-copied texts that claim to explain the mysteries of the human body. Most of these writings are filled with errors, guesses, and beliefs inherited from earlier centuries, yet they are treated as unquestionable truth. A steward stands near a slanted writing desk, flipping through a volume whose ink has faded into a patchwork of uneven strokes. The page he studies describes a list of so-called signs that supposedly reveal a woman's purity, none of them grounded in real anatomy. Medieval scholars believed the body operated according to humors, vapors, and invisible forces, so they filled their books with theories that sound definitive but rely entirely on superstition. You watch the steward trace a line of text with his finger, nodding as though the book offers guidance, unaware that its author never examined a body in any scientific sense. In this world, misunderstanding becomes doctrine, and doctrine becomes law. These ideas shape marriages, trials, and reputations, not because they are accurate, but because the people who rely on them fear admitting how little they truly know. And with every turn of the page, the myth grows stronger. Step closer to observe an open manuscript lying beneath a flickering candle. On its pages, a cramped script describes supposed indicators of purity: the tone of a woman's voice, the softness of her hands, the brightness of her eyes, even the way she steps across a room. None of these traits have any connection to physiology, yet they were repeated so often that entire communities believed them without question. Scholars, priests, and household advisors memorized these lists as if they were medical fact. The belief spread from manor to village, from church to marketplace, until they became part of the cultural foundation itself. What you're reading is not science. It is folklore disguised as knowledge. But in a society where people fear disorder more than ignorance, a confident lie often holds more power than truth. A noble family, convinced that such traits reveal character and morality, uses them to judge the young woman at the center of this story before she ever speaks a word. As the candlelight trembles over the manuscript's pages, you sense the danger of a world where authority is built on misunderstanding. These texts do not explain the body, they justify control over it. Now move toward a heavy oak table where several household advisors have gathered, each holding a different manuscript or parchment covered in diagrams that look precise but describe nothing real. One advisor points to a drawing of the human body so inaccurate it borders on imaginary. Yet he speaks with the certainty of a man convinced his knowledge is unquestionable. These advisors combine fragments of ancient writings with local superstition, creating a hybrid belief system that sounds authoritative because it is old, not because it is correct. They debate which signs matter most, arguing over details they barely understand, each trying to appear more informed than the others. The conversation grows tense, not because they seek truth, but because they fear the consequences of being wrong in a society where reputation is currency. You watch them argue over theories drawn from hearsay, their confidence masking a simple fact. None of them have ever examined the body with the intention of learning how it truly works. What they call expertise is really the recycling of ideas that comfort them. Ideas they rely on because admitting uncertainty would undermine the very structure their authority depends on. Step back as a young scribe enters the study carrying a fresh parchment on which he has copied a list of purity tests collected from various regions. Some come from remote villages, others from noble courts, but all share the same foundation of incorrect assumptions. He recites each claim with the seriousness of someone performing an important duty. That certain facial expressions reveal chastity, that specific breathing patterns show innocence, or that the posture of a woman while sitting can confirm virtue. His tone reflects the culture he was raised in, one that teaches obedience to tradition rather than curiosity. Around him, the advisors nod, not because they believe every detail, but because disagreement introduces risk. To question the list would be to question the system, and the system is what protects their social standing. As you watch the scribe set the parchment on the table with great care, it becomes clear how myths survive. Not through evidence, but through repetition. The more frequently a claim is spoken, the more natural it feels, even when it has no grounding in reality. In this environment, belief replaces investigation, and imitation becomes the closest thing to learning. Shift your attention to the far corner of the room where the priest stands with his hands clasped behind his back. quietly observing the scholars and advisors. Though he says nothing, his presence anchors the entire discussion. Religious authority grants the myths an added layer of legitimacy, transforming baseless speculation into moral guidance. The priest has read many of the same texts, and though he understands their contradictions, he also knows that questioning them would unravel the social order he is expected to uphold. The community relies on him to reinforce their beliefs, not challenge them. As he closes his eyes briefly, perhaps in reflection or fatigue, you see the weight he carries, the burden of maintaining a doctrine that blends faith with misunderstanding. He will soon be called upon to validate the inspection, and his approval will give the ritual its final stamp of righteousness. In a world where purity is treated as proof of obedience, the overlap between religious duty and social control becomes impossible to separate. The priest is not the creator of these myths, but his silence and his authority ensures they remain unchallenged. Step into the manor's upper hall, where the long night ahead is beginning to take shape. A row of candles burns along the stone walls, their flames casting unsteady light across the wooden beams overhead. Servants move quietly between the rooms, spreading fresh rushes on the floor and laying out folded linens as if preparing for a ceremonial event, rather than a private moment between two newly joined households. This is not a celebration of intimacy. It is a ritual of observation, shaped by expectations older than anyone in the building. In medieval Europe, the first night of marriage often carried a disturbing undertone. Belief that purity must be verified through a series of symbolic gestures. None of these gestures reflect reality, yet families rely on them as reassurance that their honor, alliances, and future lineage remain intact. As you walk past the doorway where preparations are taking place, the air feels heavy with anticipation. The bride has become the center of a ritual she did not design, surrounded by people who believe their futures depend on how the night is interpreted. What should be a private beginning is instead turned into a stage where reputation matters more than truth. Move closer to the central chamber and you'll find several older women arranging the room with a level of precision that reveals their true role. They smooth the linens, check the placement of the candles, and exchange quiet instructions that come from years of performing the same duties. Their presence ensures that what happens here will be witnessed indirectly, not through intimacy, but through evidence. In many households, these women are tasked with setting the scene for what the community calls proof. A ritualized expectation that something produced during the night can be presented as confirmation of purity. Though nothing explicit is observed, the symbolism alone turns the moment into a kind of performance constructed for the sake of tradition. You watch as the women adjust the wooden shutters, allowing only a faint glow from the courtyard torches to enter the room. Their movements are deliberate, almost rehearsed, because they understand exactly what the family expects to see and what must be explained the following morning. This practice has nothing to do with the bride's character or truth. It is an inherited script, performed generation after generation, designed to give the illusion of certainty in a world terrified of doubt. Step back into the hallway for a moment, where a small group of men waits in uneasy silence. They stand near the stairwell, speaking in short, restrained sentences, their eyes fixed on the chamber door as if expecting an announcement at any moment. These men, fathers, uncles, stewards, have convinced themselves that the ritual ensures honor, order, and legitimacy. Yet the truth is simpler and far more fragile. They are afraid. Afraid of scandal, afraid of gossip, afraid of losing the alliances tied to this marriage. Their concern has little to do with the bride's well-being and everything to do with their own reputations. One man paces slowly, his boots tapping against the wooden floor, while another rubs at the edge of his cloak as though trying to steady himself. They cling to tradition because it offers a sense of control in situations they cannot fully understand. You watch them from the shadows and see how deeply their fear shapes the ritual. They wait not for truth, but for reassurance. The entire evening has become a delicate performance, and they are its most anxious audience. Now return to the chamber, where the room's details reveal the weight of expectation placed on the bride. A small wooden chest sits beside the bed, filled with linens chosen specifically for the ritual. The walls are decorated with simple woven tapestries, not for beauty, but to create an atmosphere that suggests propriety and modesty. The older women check the linens once more, making sure everything is arranged exactly as the household expects. In some regions, a cloth might be presented the next morning as symbolic evidence, a tradition that has persisted despite offering no genuine insight. The bride's privacy is not the concern here. The community's comfort is. Every object in the room, from the placement of the candles to the folding of the sheets, serves one purpose: to support a narrative that has already been decided. As you take in the scene, you realize how thoroughly the ritual converts a personal moment into a communal judgment. The room is no longer a place for rest. It is a stage prepared for an impossible performance. Finally, step to the far side of the chamber where the bride now stands in silence. Her hands rest at her sides, fingers slightly curled, though she forces herself to appear calm. The older women offer her soft, rehearsed words meant to sound comforting. But she knows, as they do, that comfort is not truly possible. She is expected to embody an ideal, to uphold traditions she had no voice in shaping, and to carry the burden of a ritual that defines her worth through standards she cannot influence. Outside the chamber, the murmur of waiting guests drifts through the hall, a reminder that her private life is being treated as public property. You watch her steady her breath, not because she fears the night itself, but because she fears the judgments that will follow. She steps toward the bed, not as a newlywed beginning a life, but as a participant in a ritual that serves everyone except her. And in that quiet moment, you understand the core truth of medieval purity culture. It has never been about clarity, never been about honesty, only about maintaining a structure built on fear, reputation, and control. Walk with the crowd toward the town square, where the stone platform at the center has become a stage for judgment rather than celebration. Lanterns hang from iron hooks, their flickering light illuminating a growing audience. Merchants closing their stalls, apprentices lingering in doorways, children tugged along by curious parents. News travels quickly here. A whisper about a failed purity claim can spread faster than any truth. And by the time you reach the square, the story has already grown larger than the young woman it concerns. In medieval Europe, accusations didn't remain private for long. They became community events where guilt was assumed before anyone bothered to ask questions. A single rumor could summon a crowd, and once a crowd formed, objectivity vanished. You watch as neighbors push forward to find a better view, each one eager to hear the latest speculation. Some shake their heads knowingly. Others cross their arms with the confidence of people who believe their judgment is infallible. The tension in the air is unmistakable. This gathering isn't about fairness. It's about reaffirming a shared belief system, one built on fear, tradition, and the desire to simplify a world that rarely makes sense. Move closer to the platform and you'll see a small group of officials standing together, their expressions fixed in a mix of authority and discomfort. A constable in a heavy wool cloak holds a staff as a symbol of order, though he looks more uneasy than powerful. Beside him stands the town scribe with a wax tablet, ready to record whatever conclusion the officials decide to announce. And just off to the side, a priest waits quietly, his presence serving as both witness and reinforcement of the community's moral expectations. These figures are meant to represent justice, but their authority is tangled in the same flawed beliefs that brought the crowd here. They don't seek truth. They seek confirmation of what the community already assumes. Behind them, the young woman's family stands rigidly, caught between shame and desperation, aware that the outcome will shape not only her future, but their own standing in the town. As you watch the officials murmur among themselves, you realize how easily purity tests slip from private rituals into public trials. Once rumor becomes spectacle, no one can stop the momentum. The community demands a verdict, and the officials, bound by tradition, will provide one, whether or not it reflects reality. Step toward the edge of the platform where the young woman now stands, her posture stiff beneath the weight of dozens of watching eyes. She doesn't speak, not because she lacks words, but because she knows none of them would matter. In this society, silence is taken as evidence. Fear is interpreted as guilt, and dignity is mistaken for defiance. A pair of midwives stand nearby, summoned to give an opinion they should never have been asked to provide. Their faces reveal the conflict within them. They understand the limitations of their knowledge, yet they also understand the consequences of contradicting the expectations of the crowd. The officials lean in, listening for anything that sounds authoritative, while the surrounding townspeople wait with shallow breaths, eager for their assumptions to be validated. You watch the young woman's gaze drop to the ground, her hands clasped tightly before her. She stands alone, not because she is guilty, but because the structure around her demands a scapegoat. The moment feels less like an inquiry and more like a performance, one in which the script has already been written and every witness has already chosen a role. Truth has no place here, only confirmation. Turn your attention to the crowd, where whispers swirl through the air like drifting smoke. Some claim they always suspected something, though they offer no reason beyond vague impressions. Others repeat half-remembered tales of past scandals, using them as justification for their certainty today. A few insist that they can identify purity by appearance alone, reinforcing their confidence with old sayings passed from one generation to the next. None of these statements hold meaning, yet every voice adds pressure to the officials on the platform. The louder the crowd becomes, the more the accusations feel like truth. People cling to these beliefs because they fear chaos, fear that the world is more complicated, more uncontrollable than they want to admit. So they repeat stories and look for patterns where none exist. You watch a mother pull her daughter close, whispering warnings meant to protect her in a world that demands perfection. Another man folds his arms tightly, convinced that authority must uphold tradition. The overall mood is not anger, but anticipation. The restless expectation that judgment is imminent. In this environment, rumor transforms into law, and the community's desire for certainty outweighs its responsibility for fairness. Now shift your focus back to the platform, where the officials prepare to speak. Their expressions betray hesitation, but hesitation has no place here. The constable steps forward, raising his staff to command silence. The crowd obeys instantly, leaning closer as though they already know what the verdict will be. The priest folds his hands, offering a solemn nod that will be interpreted as moral endorsement, even if he has doubts he cannot voice. The midwives exchange uneasy glances, aware that their earlier comments, cautious, uncertain, incomplete, will now be taken as definitive. The young woman stands motionless, waiting for a judgment that has less to do with her actions and more to do with the fears of those around her. When the constable begins to speak, his words feel rehearsed, shaped by tradition rather than evidence. The crowd listens with the eagerness of people hungry for closure. They want the issue resolved, the discomfort erased, the threat to their collective beliefs eliminated. Whether the verdict is fair or cruel, true or false, becomes irrelevant. What matters is that the ritual be completed. As the announcement echoes across the square, you understand that this moment is not justice. It is the preservation of a system built to protect itself. Travel now from the town square to the great halls of the nobility, where power is measured not only in land and gold, but in the purity of the women who bind dynasties together. In these stone-fortified estates, marriage is rarely a union of affection. It is a political agreement, a strategy crafted to secure borders, forge alliances, and ensure heirs whose legitimacy cannot be questioned. As you step into a royal audience chamber, you'll notice courtiers in fine wool and embroidered silk clustered around long wooden tables, speaking in cautious tones. Here, purity is treated as political currency. A princess's value is not determined by her intelligence or leadership, but by whether she can be presented as untouched and therefore suitable for forging alliances between kingdoms. Every gesture she makes, every friendship she forms, every rumor whispered about her carries diplomatic weight. Even her upbringing is tailored to preserve an image of perfection. You watch as advisors discuss her future with the same detachment they would use for negotiating a trade route. In this world, royal alliances rely on myths dressed as truths. Myths that demand unquestioned purity from women while excusing nearly anything from men. Step deeper into the chamber and you'll find a royal physician standing beside a carved wooden lectern, reviewing scrolls written in a mix of medical theory and folklore. His green wool robe marks him as an educated man, yet the texts he relies on contain as many assumptions as the manuscripts found in village manors. He is expected to provide assessments that reassure kings and queens, not challenge their beliefs. Behind him, a cluster of nobles listens closely, eager to hear confirmation that the princess destined for an upcoming alliance meets every requirement of purity. The physician explains his conclusions with deliberate calm, his voice steady even though the criteria he cites hold no scientific merit. His words shape diplomatic outcomes, influence treaties, and determine the fates of entire kingdoms. A single statement from him can strengthen alliances or unravel them. You watch as nobles nod solemnly, accepting his claims without question. Their confidence has nothing to do with truth. It stems from the need for political stability. Here, purity tests serve not only as personal judgments, but as instruments of statecraft, tools used to maintain power in a world where appearances matter far more than reality. Walk toward the far end of the chamber where a group of diplomats from neighboring regions stand in a semicircle, their cloaks lined with fur and their belts decorated with finely worked metal clasps. They have traveled days, sometimes weeks, to negotiate alliances that depend entirely on the reputation of the young woman under discussion. Their expressions remain carefully neutral, but their questions are pointed. They ask about upbringing, tutors, household customs, and conduct, all framed as polite inquiries but designed to uncover any hint of impropriety. None of these men have ever met the princess they analyze so meticulously, yet they speak as though they understand her life better than she does. Their conversations treat her not as a person, but as a condition that must be met before treaties move forward. You stand among them and feel the weight of their scrutiny, not directed at an individual, but at the ideal she is expected to embody. In these halls, purity becomes a guarantee of political stability, a symbolic assurance that heirs will be legitimate and alliances will remain unbroken. The princess's future and the course of international diplomacy rests on judgments made by people who prioritize political advantage over truth. Now step into an adjoining council chamber where a heated discussion unfolds among royal advisors. A long wooden table dominates the center of the room, its surface crowded with maps, sealed letters, and wax tablets documenting negotiations. Here, debates are not about the princess herself, but about how her perceived purity will affect trade routes, military pacts, and territorial claims. One advisor argues that rumors, even unfounded ones, could weaken the kingdom's position. Another insists that the alliance is too important to risk, urging everyone to dismiss gossip as the work of rivals. Yet a third advisor warns that foreign courts may seize upon any uncertainty to demand greater concessions. Their voices rise and fall as they attempt to calculate the political cost of every possibility. None of them mention the young woman's personal feelings. None consider the reality that purity tests have no basis in knowledge. To them, the test is simply a tool, a mechanism to predict political outcomes. As you listen, it becomes clear that the advisors are less concerned with what is true and more concerned with how truth can be shaped to serve the crown. In this world, perception outweighs reality, and purity becomes a bargaining chip on the diplomatic table. Finally, step into a quieter alcove where a few members of the royal family sit apart from the advisors and diplomats. Their faces reveal a mixture of worry and resignation. They know that the princess's reputation will soon be discussed far beyond the palace walls, carried by messengers, merchants, and noble emissaries to distant courts. A single whisper, whether malicious or accidental, could unravel years of careful planning. The princess herself sits beside a small window, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she stares toward the courtyard below. She understands the expectations placed upon her, even if she cannot influence them. Her identity has been shaped not by her accomplishments, but by the demands of dynasty. You see her take a steady breath, not in fear, but in quiet resolve. She knows that the political world surrounding her will continue to use purity as a measure of worth, regardless of truth. The pressure she faces is immense, yet she endures it with a calm born of necessity. In this moment, the contrast becomes painfully clear. While men negotiate territories and treaties, she carries the burden of a myth that dictates her value before she ever speaks a word. Step away from the royal chambers and into the quieter spaces of the castle. The weaving rooms, the herb cellars, the narrow walkways where women move unseen by the advisors who claim to understand them. Here, away from public scrutiny, you begin to see another side of medieval life. The quiet resistance practiced by women who learned how to navigate the rigid expectations placed upon them. In these hidden corners, knowledge is passed in whispers rather than manuscripts. Older women teach younger ones how to survive scrutiny, how to move through a world that demands impossible perfection. They share small strategies: how to speak carefully, how to avoid suspicious friendships, how to behave in a way that satisfies tradition without surrendering their sense of self. Nothing they do is loud or confrontational. Their strength lies in subtlety. As you stand among them, watching hands work wool or sort herbs with practiced ease, it becomes clear that resistance in this world isn't rebellion, it's endurance. These women create networks built on trust, offering each other the support that society refuses. They know the purity system is flawed, but rather than allowing it to crush them, they find ways to move within it while quietly undermining its power. Walk through a dim passageway into a chamber where two midwives and a young servant girl sit close together, their voices barely above a whisper. They lean over a small wooden table covered with herbs, pins, and folded cloth, tools not of defiance, but of protection. These women have seen too many lives disrupted by false accusations and arbitrary judgments, so they offer guidance where they can. Sometimes that guidance means reassuring a frightened bride. Sometimes it means finding a way to soothe a noble family's fears. And sometimes it means bending the expectations of the ritual just enough to shield someone from the harshest consequences. They are not openly challenging the system. Doing so would put their own lives at risk. Instead, they navigate a delicate balance using knowledge, empathy, and discretion to soften a process that was never meant to be fair. As you watch them speak, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of an oil lamp, you realize they are performing the quiet work of preservation. In a world where purity is treated as absolute, these women carve out small spaces where humanity still matters. Their actions do not dismantle the myth, but they keep it from destroying everyone caught within it. Continue down the corridor and into a modest workroom where a group of women gathers after completing their daily tasks. Their clothing is simple: wool gowns, linen aprons, sleeves rolled back from hours of labor. Yet their conversations carry a depth and purpose unseen in the grand halls above. One woman speaks quietly about a cousin in a distant village who survived a damaging rumor because the local healer chose compassion over convention. Another shares advice passed down from her grandmother about navigating household expectations without drawing unwelcome attention. These stories travel from village to manor, from servant quarters to castle walls, forming an informal network of survival strategies. The women do not see themselves as rebels, and perhaps they are not. What they practice is a kind of communal wisdom: how to avoid dangerous scrutiny, how to interpret the mood of a household, how to keep a young girl safe in a world eager to judge her. As you watch them pass a basket of wool between them, working as they speak, you understand that these conversations are more than idle chatter. They are lessons, life-saving instructions wrapped in everyday tasks, preserved through generations of necessity. Move toward the kitchens, where the heat from the hearth fills the air and the sound of chopping and grinding creates a steady rhythm. Here, Among pots of boiling broth and baskets of freshly washed vegetables, you witness another form of quiet defiance: cooperation. The cooks, scullery maids, and servers know the inner workings of the household better than any advisor or steward. They hear the rumors early, see the tensions rising, and understand when a young woman is at risk of becoming the target of scrutiny. Without ever speaking openly, they shift their routines to offer small protections: a discreet warning, a sympathetic ear, a bit of guidance to avoid a dangerous encounter. None of these actions break the rules, but they bend them just enough to create space for someone to breathe. The kitchen becomes a place where information is exchanged under the cover of ordinary tasks, hidden in the clatter of wooden utensils and the hiss of boiling water. You sense that these women rely on instinct rather than authority, supporting one another not through rebellion but through unity. Their strength lies in cooperation, a quiet force that keeps the weight of tradition from becoming unbearable. Finally, step into a small alcove near the servants' quarters, where a handful of women gather at the end of the evening. The day's work has left their shoulders tired and their hands rough, yet their expressions carry a steady determination. They sit close together, sharing stories, offering reassurance, and discussing ways to help the younger girls who will soon face the expectations they themselves endured. One woman speaks about the importance of keeping watch over each other. Another stresses the need to counter harmful rumors before they spread, while a third reminds them that even a single whispered warning can protect someone vulnerable. Their voices are soft, but their resolve is strong. This is where the true resistance lives: in mutual care, in the refusal to let the system break the ones who come after them. They cannot dismantle the purity myth, not openly, not safely, but they can blunt its edges. They can ensure that behind every harsh tradition stands a community ready to offer comfort and protection. As you leave the alcove, you realize that these women have built a quiet, enduring network of resilience. In a world defined by judgment, they choose solidarity. Enter the quiet nave of a medieval church, where rows of wooden benches stretch beneath vaulted stone arches, and the scent of incense lingers in the cool air. This is where purity myths gain their deepest roots, not in science, not in observation, but in stories repeated so often that they begin to shape the world itself. In these halls, the lives of saintly virgins are praised in carved reliefs and painted panels, their tales told with a certainty that leaves no room for doubt or nuance. Young women are taught to admire these figures, to model themselves after ideals that no human being could realistically live up to. You watch as a priest stands near the altar, recounting yet another tale of miraculous purity, his voice echoing against the stone walls. These stories, though filled with impossible claims, are accepted as moral lessons that define how women should behave and what communities should expect of them. In this environment, purity becomes less a personal virtue and more a public standard, one backed by the authority of faith and tradition, reinforced through rituals, prayers, and sacred art that leave little room for questions. Move farther down the aisle and you'll find a group of townspeople gathered near a side chapel, listening intently as the priest offers guidance during confession. His words, intended to offer comfort, often blend moral instruction with social expectation. Women are urged to guard their behavior, avoid suspicion, and maintain a reputation that reflects well on their families. Men, meanwhile, receive gentler warnings, reminders to act with responsibility rather than purity. This imbalance shapes the community's understanding of virtue. The priest's guidance carries weight because he is seen as the interpreter of divine will, someone whose voice gives structure to moral life. Even when he personally doubts the accuracy of purity tests or the fairness of the rituals tied to them, speaking against tradition risks undermining the authority of the church itself. And so the cycle continues. The confessional becomes a place where private concerns turn into public assumptions, where whispered fears become fuel for gossip, and where the expectations placed on women grow heavier with each sermon and story. Standing in the dim light of stained glass, you can feel how deeply faith is intertwined with judgment. and how easily belief becomes a tool for control. Step into a small alcove where relics are displayed behind iron grills. Fragments of cloth, carved wooden icons, and tiny glass vials said to contain traces of miracles. Pilgrims approach these objects with reverence, whispering prayers and touching the cold metal bars as if the relics themselves can grant purity or restore honor. Many of these artifacts come with stories claiming that they proved a woman's innocence or protected her from accusation. Tales passed from one generation to the next without anyone questioning their origins. These relics serve as physical anchors for beliefs that have little connection to reality, giving communities a sense of certainty in a world full of unknowns. You watch as a mother guides her daughter to kneel before a painted panel, encouraging her to model herself after a saint whose biography is more legend than truth. The girl nods obediently, unaware that these stories were shaped to control, not empower. In this alcove, the blending of faith and folklore becomes unmistakable. The relics do not validate purity. They validate the expectations tied to it. They reinforce a worldview where women are measured against impossible standards, upheld by objects whose history is more myth than fact. Now step outside the church into the courtyard, where townspeople linger under the open sky, discussing the priest's teachings with the confidence of people who believe their judgments carry moral authority. Some repeat lessons they've heard countless times, linking purity to divine favor or misfortune. Others cite examples from scripture or saintly tales as if they were evidence rather than allegory. These conversations travel quickly through the community, especially among women, who are constantly reminded that their reputations depend on how closely they align with religious ideals. Even small deviations, a late walk home, a friendship with the wrong person, a misunderstood action, can spark suspicion. Men, by contrast, are rarely judged through this lens. Their mistakes are forgiven, contextualized, or ignored, while women bear the full weight of moral expectation. You watch as a young girl listens to these discussions, absorbing the unspoken warning that her worth is tied to vigilance and restraint. The courtyard bustles with movement, but beneath the activity lies a quiet certainty. The church's teachings shape more than spirituality. They shape social order, reinforcing who is trusted, who is doubted, and who has the power to speak. Return to the interior of the church once more, where the priest extinguishes the final candles near the altar, leaving only a faint glow from the high windows. The quiet of the empty nave reveals a truth hidden beneath the sermons and rituals. Purity, as defined here, has never been about understanding the human body or honoring individual experience. It has been about maintaining structure, a structure that defines virtue through obedience and enforces order through fear of judgment. The priest pauses for a moment, his shoulders slightly hunched, as though weighed down by the doctrines he must uphold. Perhaps he senses that the expectations placed on women are neither fair nor sustainable. But the cost of challenging tradition is too great. He turns away, locking the doors for the night, leaving the myths undisturbed. In the silence, you see how deeply the purity narrative has woven itself into every corner of the community. In the stories of saints, in whispered confessions, in the daily behavior of families shaped by fear. The church does not need to enforce these beliefs directly. The beliefs enforce themselves, carried forward by people who think they are protecting order when, in truth, they are protecting a system built on misunderstanding. Walk into a small chamber near the castle archives, where late medieval scholars have begun to gather around newly copied medical texts brought from distant universities. The air feels different here, quieter, more thoughtful, as if the people in this room recognize that the world is slowly shifting beneath their feet. Stacked on the wooden table are manuscripts that question long-held assumptions, documents written by physicians who have started observing the human body directly rather than relying on ancient folklore. Their language is still imperfect, still bound by superstition, but a spark of skepticism has begun to take hold. You watch as a scholar in a wool robe runs his finger down the page, frowning at descriptions that contradict everything he was taught. Around him, others murmur in agreement. They are not ready to abandon tradition, but for the first time, they acknowledge that the old explanations fail to match what they see. This is where the collapse begins. Not with rebellion, but with quiet doubt. The purity tests that once shaped reputations and determined marriages start to feel less certain, less necessary, less defensible. In this room, the foundations of the myth begin to tremble. Move down the corridor to a council room where local magistrates meet to revise town statutes. Their wooden table is covered in scrolls, records of disputes, marriages, and accusations that once relied heavily on purity claims. Now, as more cases reveal contradictions and injustices, the magistrates shift uncomfortably in their seats. One man points to a recent ruling where a woman was falsely accused, the evidence collapsing under closer scrutiny. Another mentions that neighboring towns have quietly removed purity examinations from their legal proceedings. The conversation is cautious but unmistakably different from what it would have been a generation earlier. These officials are beginning to understand that relying on rituals and assumptions has caused more harm than clarity. They discuss replacing old customs with new guidelines emphasizing behavior, character testimony, or property agreements instead of myth. As you listen, you sense a slow unraveling. Not a dramatic overturning of tradition, but a steady erosion driven by practicality. The purity myth does not die with defiance. It dies because it no longer serves the needs of a changing society. Here, in this modest chamber, you witness the first steps toward dismantling a system that once felt unshakable. Step outside into the courtyard, where the rhythms of daily life continue around you. Traders unloading carts, apprentices sweeping stone paths, children chasing each other beneath the shadows of the walls. These people aren't discussing manuscripts or legal reforms, yet they feel the change just the same. Rumors about purity carry less weight than they once did. A merchant shrugs off a story he might have repeated a decade earlier. A mother hesitates before warning her daughter about reputation, realizing the advice no longer fits the world her child is growing into. Even the servants, who once watched households fracture under accusations, speak more openly about the unfairness they witnessed. None of them would call this progress. They simply recognize that the old ways explain less and less. Without realizing it, the community begins adjusting its expectations, demanding fewer rituals, questioning fewer appearances, allowing room for mistakes that once would have sparked judgment. Change does not arrive loudly. It settles into the spaces between conversations, shaping attitudes long before anyone acknowledges it. In this courtyard, you see how ordinary people help weaken the purity myth by quietly refusing to carry it forward with the same determination their parents once did. Now walk toward the manor where the next generation is growing up. Boys practicing with wooden swords in the yard, girls learning handwriting beside open windows, all of them absorbing lessons that differ subtly from those taught to their elders. A young tutor explains that character is shown through kindness or responsibility, not through unprovable claims tied to a person's body. A mother praises her daughter's wit rather than her quietness. These changes are small, almost invisible, yet they accumulate. While older traditions still linger, their grip weakens as new ideas spread through households, schools, and workplaces. Even the church begins shifting its language, focusing more on moral conduct and less on bodily purity. The stories of saints remain, but they are told with less insistence, less pressure, fewer warnings. In this environment, the purity myth begins to lose its authority. The young people growing up here may still hear the old expectations, but they do not inherit them with the same fear. They question more, challenge more, and accept less without explanation. As you watch them move through their lessons, you realize that a belief system can vanish not through conflict, but through quiet indifference. Finally, step into the fading light of evening as the town settles into its nightly routine. The streets are calm, the windows glowing softly behind shutters, and the echoes of the day grow faint. In this peaceful moment, you can see the full arc of the purity myth, how it rose from misunderstanding, how it shaped lives through fear and ritual, and how it ultimately unraveled when the world no longer needed it. The myth does not disappear suddenly. It fades as people stop repeating it, as laws stop enforcing it, as parents stop teaching it with the same urgency. What remains are the memories of those who carried its burdens, women whose lives were shaped by standards they could never control. As you walk toward the edge of the town, the sky deepening into dusk, you sense a quiet truth. Societies rarely admit when they've been wrong. They simply move on. The purity test, once treated as sacred and unquestionable, becomes another relic of a past built on fear. And though its shadow lingers in stories and traditions, the people who once upheld it begin to step into a world shaped less by myth and more by understanding. One small generation at a time.
If you made it this far, thank you for spending your time here. If you'd like to hear more quiet history like this, consider subscribing. Your support truly means a lot.